Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and the title of today's presentation is The Incredible Shrinking Abductee. I've got about 20 cases I want to present to you which show how dazzlingly advanced ET technology is, particularly in their ability to control space itself. There's been a lot of research into time anomalies associated with UFOs, but not as much research into spatial anomalies. So that's what I want to talk about here. There are many different types, and the first type I want to talk about is what is known as a TARDIS. A TARDIS is a time and relative dimension in space, or basically an object that's larger on the inside than the outside. A TARDIS was popularized first in the Doctor Who series, the television series, with the interdimensional, fourth dimensional telephone booth used by Doctor Who to traverse various dimensions. And this object was larger on the inside than the outside. This is something that we see quite a bit in literature and film. Certainly we see it with Mary Poppins and her handbag, in which she carried all kinds of lights and house plants and what have you. We see this in the Dungeons and Dragons game with the secret bag of holding. We see this in quite a number of places, certainly in the Harry Potter series. Superfans will of course know it as Mr. Perkins' tent. So these are objects that are larger on the inside than they appear on the outside. And this turns up in a bunch of UFO cases. A couple of cases I'd like to talk about come from Jacques Vallee, a very well-known UFO researcher and the author of many, many books on UFOs. And he's run across a couple of cases in which UFOs are much bigger on the inside than on the outside. One such case occurred on November 2nd, 1975, outside of the town of Happy Camp. There were 5 witnesses who were driving along and came upon a fog bank, saw a UFO, had missing time. One of the witnesses, Helen White, was taken on board, and she definitely reported this weird spatial anomaly. As Jacques Vallee writes, and I'm quoting, "The most puzzling fact in the experience was the size of the object. The craft into which Helen White was abducted was much larger inside than outside." Jacques Vallee was particularly intrigued by this report because he had run across it before. He had a case in Gilroy, California. This was reported in his book Confrontations, as was the previous case. This next case from Gilroy, California took place in August of 1973 and involved quite a few of witnesses in the area, about 20 witnesses from different locations. One of the witnesses was Miss Victor, who later was actually taken on board this craft. And she reported the same thing. She was very confused about the size of the craft because from the outside it appeared to be about the size of a house, but inside it had multiple levels and appeared to be much, much larger. And Jacques Vallee found this all very intriguing, particularly in regards to what this might imply about the UFO phenomena and the origin of these objects. And as Jacques Vallee writes in his book Confrontations, "Although aeronautical engineers will scoff at this bizarre detail, the topologists among my readers may be intrigued, as I was, by the possible interpretations it opened. If there are more than 4 dimensions, as many theoretical physicists now suspect, it may be interesting to speculate. A hypercraft capable of topological inversion into our space-time continuum could indeed be larger on the outside than on the inside." So by topological inversion, Jacques Vallee is basically saying that space can be transformed sort of inside out, inverted. And an object that is small in appearance on the outside can actually appear to be much larger on the inside and actually contain greater space because it's moving into another dimension. And quite a few UFO cases reflect this. An excellent case involving this bizarre detail comes from Sergeant Charles Moody. His case was investigated by Jim and Coral Lorenzen. It occurred on August 13th, 1975, outside of Alamogordo, New Mexico, when Sergeant Charles Moody went outside to watch a meteor shower that evening and came upon a landed UFO. This object just dropped down out of the sky near him. He was approached by humanoids and dragged forcibly into a craft. He said that this craft from the outside appeared to be about 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. He was taken inside to a room about that size, he thinks, and physically examined. He was then treated more in a different manner, I guess, when he overcame his fear. And the ETs then proceeded to take him out of the large examination room into what appeared to be the engine room. And this really shocked Charles because the engine room itself was also very large. It had these weird crystals in it all lined up next to metal rods. ETs were explaining how they use electromagnetism to power their craft. There was a weird black box. He saw a bunch of other stuff. The ETs gave him various messages, so that they had a larger craft rotating the Earth and other bases and would one day reveal themselves. At any rate, important here is the size of the craft, which really perplexed Charles Moody and also Jim and Coral Lorenzen. As Coral Lorenzen writes, Moody was later very perplexed about this because the first room was as large as the second, and he didn't see how the two would fit into the craft as he observed it from the outside. That's a wonderful case which has never been disproven, and there's other cases that have this same exact feature. Another excellent case is that of Carl Higdon of Rawlins, Wyoming. Carl Higdon was a hunter, and on October 25th, 1974, he was out hunting elk. Spotted a herd of elk and took a shot at one when his bullet stopped and fell to the ground. That's when he noticed a strange figure approaching him. This figure invited Carl Higdon aboard a craft. Carl looked and saw this very small object, metallic, rectangular in shape, not too far away. He said it was actually not that large at all. As Carl Higdon says, it was a transparent cube-shaped object resting on the ground. No sooner had the being invited Carl Higdon on board when he found himself inside. And as Carl Higdon says, it was much smaller than any of our commercial or military planes. In fact, you're going to think I'm crazy, but this thing couldn't have been more than 5 feet high, 7 feet long, and 14.5 feet wide. Tiny is the only word I can think of to accurately describe its size. Before I was able to move a muscle, I found myself inside this contraption. It was instantaneous. How I was able to fit inside remains a riddle. They must have shrunk me. That's the only explanation that seems plausible. This really puzzled him. He knows it was larger because he could see the 5 elk on one side of the room in a glass cage. He was taken to a room and physically examined. At some point, he was apparently taken to another planet. It's a long, complex case. It's got an enormous amount of physical evidence in support of it. Carl Higdon's truck was found some distance away from where he parked it in the middle of a field with no tracks to how it got there. At the time Higdon had his abduction experience, there were other people in the area who actually witnessed a UFO. Carl Higdon himself did not remember his onboard segment until some time later. He was severely traumatized and recalled it under hypnosis with the help of Leo Sprinkle, who hypnotically regressed him. It's just a very interesting case. In fact, Carl Higdon reported 2 healings as a result of his encounter. He was healed of kidney stones and also of scars on his lungs caused by tuberculosis. But what's important here is the size of this craft on the outside compared to the inside. As Carl Higdon says, this craft was 5 feet high, 7 feet wide, and about 14 feet long. But inside it was much larger. And as Carl Higdon says, and again I'm quoting, "Rationally, I know that in order for me, the aliens, and the elk to get in there, we must have been shrunk. There's no other way. I wouldn't venture how they accomplished this feat." So Carl Higdon doesn't remember being physically shrunk, but this is what he thinks is happening here. It didn't even occur to him that the object might be bigger on the inside. But maybe he is being shrunk, because there are, as we'll see, there are cases that lean towards this theory. But a number of cases seem to show that these objects are just very simply larger on the inside than they are on the outside. There was a case that I presented in my book, UFOs over Colorado. This case occurred on April 9th, 1955. The main witness is Marty Minetto. He lived on a ranch with his family at the time. He was just a little kid, age 5, when he had this experience with his grandfather. One evening, his grandfather took him out purposefully for a pre-arranged appointment with a UFO, and they met these friendly-looking ETs. They were walking along this little dirt road near their home when a craft dropped down out of the sky. According to Marty, it was about the size of a small house, could cover the width of the road or so. His grandfather approached first, talked with 2 human-looking humanoids, and then Marty was invited on board and given basically a tour of the craft. And inside, the craft was absolutely huge. As Marty says, it appeared to be about as big as a football field and filled with human-looking people. It was, he estimated, on the inside, 40 feet high and at least 120 feet long, with 2 decks lit up in a white-pink light. So very large from the inside. At some point, Marty asked the ETs where they come from, and they gave him your sort of typical enigmatic answer. They replied that, "We come from between my time and yours. We come from a place here on Earth, but beneath your time in a different phase." So this sort of points towards their ability, again, to control space. And if they can control space, they can certainly control time. But here's another very interesting case involving someone who's been taken on board a craft and reported that it's much bigger on the inside than the outside. This case comes from Barry Littleton. I talked to him personally. He's a very interesting and very kind man. He's quite well known within the UFO field. He's got his own Facebook group. It's called TARDIS, actually, which again is an object that's larger on the inside than the outside. He also has his own very well-received YouTube channel. I highly recommend checking it out because there's this one video on there called UFOs and Temporal Displacement, where Barry Littleton speaks about his own encounters with being taken on board a UFO that was larger on the inside than the outside. It was just a small little craft, but he was taken from room to room to room, which seemed to form as he went into them, as if it was sort of fourth dimensional. So it's just another very interesting case that speaks towards this. And there are others. One gentleman I interviewed for my book, Onboard UFO Encounters, is Joe Gardner, a really nice man from Huntington, West Virginia. He had this experience actually with his family. This was in the summer of 1974. They went out to go pick wild blackberries. This was a fun family activity that they did each year. And they went driving down the roads and actually went across the border into Kentucky when they passed what appeared to be a spaceship house, is what they called it. It was this saucer-shaped metallic structure on very tall stilts, and it looked like a house. That's what they thought it was at the time. And they actually got out of the car and approached this thing. Long story short, they ended up having missing time and being taken on board, the entire family of 4. Again, this object was about the size of a house, but once on board, Joe reports that it was absolutely much larger on the inside. He was taken through several rooms, which were very large. In fact, one room was so large he didn't even see the wall. So again, there appears to be an interdimensional aspect to the interior of these UFOs, or they can change, they're bigger on the inside than on the outside. So that's one category. Another category that's just as interesting is the ET's ability to change the size of their craft. There's countless cases in which UFOs have changed shape from circular to triangular to cigar-shaped to what have you, weird blobs. UFOs not only change shape, they can expand in size or contract, sometimes appearing as little balls of light and growing into motherships, or starting as giant ships and shrinking down. Sometimes they just turn transparent and disappear. Turning at right angles, they do all kinds of things that are interdimensional, and this appears to be related to their ability to control space, and they can definitely change the size of their craft. One very interesting case that points towards this comes from abductee Bill Foster. He wrote a book about his experiences called The Black Triangle Abduction. On November 16, 1996, Bill and Peggy Foster were driving with 2 friends through the town of Yadkinville, North Carolina, when they saw a very large triangular-shaped UFO. They had missing time, didn't realize at the time that they had actually been abducted, but later, realized that they had missing time and went under hypnosis. And under hypnosis, recalled a long drawn-out onboard UFO encounter. And what was really interesting is how big this craft was. According to Bill Foster, it was, quote, at least a city block in diameter. So following this incident and several hypnosis sessions, Bill Foster realized he was a lifelong abductee. He started having fully conscious encounters. He finally got over his fear and would often converse with the ETs. They were usually very tight-lipped and would say nothing other than, "Don't be afraid," and would refuse to answer his questions. But one time Bill wouldn't take no for an answer, and he got some very interesting information about the size of their craft. One day he was taken on board. They were physically examining him, and he turned to one of the gray ETs and said, and I'm quoting, "I want to see more of this place. I am sick of this same room every time. How big is this place?" The ET didn't answer, so Bill repeated his question, and finally the ET looked at him in what Bill Foster perceived as amusement. And this gray actually smiled at him, as Bill Foster writes, "Now that's the first time I ever saw this guy smile." And he said, "It's as big as we want it to be." So the ETs told him that they have the ability to control the size of their craft as it suits their needs. And this is exactly what other witnesses have reported. I investigated one case personally involving a gentleman by the name of Kevin Cammon. His account appeared in my book, Inside UFOs. He's a Navy corpsman who in 1982 was stationed in the Navy and was with his friend out in the Philippines in the Atlantic Ocean. And he had an encounter. His friend was a contactee and basically invited him on board the UFO. To Kevin's shock, this actually worked. Long story short, he found himself aboard this very large kind of diamond-shaped craft. It was hard to tell what shape it was because it was dazzlingly bright and at least as large as the Navy ship itself, which was about 600 feet. At any rate, he finds himself in this room, and he was visited with praying mantis type ETs. He describes them as being about 15 feet tall. There was a chest-high console running along one edge of the room. The floor was like a metallic grate. He had a long conversation with these ETs, but important here is he started to notice that the room was changing in size. Sometimes it would be smaller, 20 feet across. At one point he asked where they were from, and the room seemed to expand in size to at least 50 feet, and they showed him this star chart. So they had this apparent ability to control space itself. So this is apparently something they have the ability to do. The most interesting case, in my humble opinion, of this kind comes from researcher John Lear, who has done a lot of UFO research. John Lear talks about a case which occurred in 1973 to an Army photographer by the name of Mike. Mike was just a petty photographer, and suddenly his security clearance was upgraded to top secret, and he was shipped off to Norton Air Force Base in California, which, by the way, has been implicated in a number of UFO cases involving UFO crash retrievals. And that's certainly what happened here. Mike was driven to a hangar, and inside the hangar there was this very large silver saucer-shaped object, metallic, and he said it appeared to be about 35 feet wide, was hanging from cables, some height in the air. There was a small opening, and it was Mike's job to take photographs of the inside of this object. So they lifted him up and put him inside, and this is when Mike got a real shock. As Mike says, and I'm quoting, "The inside looked to be about 10 times the size of the outside. I could have thrown a football as hard as I could and not hit the other side." So Leonard Stringfield is also a researcher specializing in crash retrievals, and he was able to interview this witness as well. And once again, the witness reiterated how struck he was by the difference in the size from the inside of this thing and the outside. As the witness told Leonard Stringfield, he poked his head back outside to check the size, which still appeared to be about 35 feet in diameter as before. In other words, he had to do a double take because this darn thing was more than twice as big on the inside, more than 10 times as big on the inside than on the outside. And this was something that's sitting here in a military hangar. So this is incredible, and it doesn't even stop there. These spatial anomalies take different types of variations. Another variation we see are tiny little UFOs, miniature UFOs. Certainly there are a lot of cases of tiny balls of light, but sometimes people see what appear to be miniature flying saucers with miniature little ETs coming out of them. A very interesting case comes from respected researcher John Keel. This occurred in August of 1965 during a nationwide UFO flap. This particular case occurred in Seattle, Washington, to a young lady who woke up in her bedroom. She was unable to move when suddenly this tiny UFO flew in through the window. And I'll just quote John Keel directly, as John Keel writes, "A football-sized dull gray object sailed in through an open window and landed on tripod legs on her floor. A tiny ramp descended from the craft, and 5 or 6 little people dressed in tight-fitting clothes climbed down it to work on repairs. Their job finished, they stepped into the craft and flew away. Only then was the witness, who was certain that she was wide awake, able to move. Yeah, miniature UFO with miniature aliens, and it's not a unique case. There was a wave of miniature UFOs in the 1970s in the country of Malaysia. The real case that started it all and caused sort of a furor in the press occurred on August 21st, 1970. What happened was this student by the name of K. Wigneswaran was missing from his classroom. A search was conducted and they found this kid who was 10 years old, unconscious in the brush outside the school. They revived him and the student had an incredible story. He said that a tiny UFO about the size of a football landed, a little alien about inches high, got out. It was dressed in a little suit. It had a little weapon, apparently, because the student ran towards the being and tried to capture it. And this little tiny humanoid pulled out what appeared to be a little blaster, as the kid said, some sort of laser gun, and shot at the student, striking him in the leg and causing him to black out. And that's where they found him. And the kid pointed to his leg, and there was a wound where this being had apparently shot him, a little burn mark. So that seemed to be evidence of his encounter, and further corroboration came in the weeks that followed when more than 6 other students in several separate independent incidents reported seeing these tiny UFOs with tiny humanoids next to them. And there was a wave of sightings across Malaysia involving these tiny UFOs. Another incident occurred 2 years later in April of 1973 when several children and one adult actually at the Ipoh Perak Primary School saw a very small UFO land on the playground. As they watched, these very small entities got out. They were dressed in shiny white suits. The adult and the students ran towards this craft. The little beings immediately returned to their tiny little ship, and it took off. So I know there are other cases like this. It's very strange. Perhaps ETs have the ability to shrink down their craft too. And as further cases show, these abilities extend to not just craft, but to people as well. What's really interesting is there is a long it's not a new idea, this idea that people can be shrunk down. We see this in one of the first novels ever published, which was Gulliver's Travels, and involved a gentleman who traveled to various mythical lands where he saw giants as well as tiny little people. And this idea has always fascinated humans, and we see it all over film and literature. We see it in a lot of films, actually, like the very popular film The Borrowers, which has been remade at least twice. Alice in Wonderland as well. Alice goes down the rabbit hole, and she keeps changing in size. We see it in the movie The Incredible Shrinking Man, or in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, in which a little kid was shrunk down in size. Fantastic Voyage with Isaac Asimov, both a novel and a movie. Inner Space. There's so many movies that feature this. Most recently, perhaps, would be Downsizing with Matt Damon. Or Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. That's another popular one. So again, this is not a new idea, but apparently this is something the ETs do have the ability to do. A great case comes from abductee Betty Andreasson. She's a very well-known figure in the UFO community. She's from Ashburnham, Massachusetts, and has had UFO encounters her whole life. UFO researcher Raymond Fowler has worked closely with her and written a series of books about her case. And Betty had a really interesting incident involving UFOs displaying in this technology where they have the ability to shrink not only their ships, but people too. Betty was outside her home with the gray ETs. There was another man and a woman there, several grays. There was a fairly large ship, about 48 feet wide, but it's actually small compared to a very large craft that was hovering overhead. And I'll just let Betty describe what happened when this very large craft hovering overhead shrinks this smaller craft. As Betty says, that man over there, they're telling him to get up or something because he's getting up and he's following the beings into the craft that they came out of. They're going inside, and that lady's getting up. They're taking that lady too. They're taking her over to the craft that the man was brought into. That big craft or ship. And it's just hovering now over the smaller one. Now suddenly the lights on the circular part of it went on and lit the whole bottom up. The bottom of the top craft. They're shrinking that craft. That ship is getting smaller from those lights around the edge in the bottom of that big ship. The craft was shrunk down to the size of a car with the man and the lady in it, and the beings. That big one had shrunk it down to about the size of a car. And that man and that lady and the other beings in it left. That small craft left. So what Betty is saying is that very large craft that was hovering over the 48-foot wide small craft shrunk down the 48-foot wide small craft to about the size of a car, which is what, 6-10 feet in length, with people and grays in it. And that really freaked her out because suddenly there was another craft that was now parked again below the larger craft, and they were escorting her inside. As Betty says, and again I quote, "We're going to go inside, but that big craft is right above us. I wonder if they're going to shrink us too. We're getting in line and swooping in. And oh, it feels so strange, just cool, moving upward and into the craft. We're all inside and the door's closing." Betty Andreasson doesn't describe I'm not sure if she even knows whether she was actually shrunk down in this particular case. But the ETs did at one point explain to her that they do have the technological ability to shrink or enlarge both their craft and people and objects. They called it deopulating or opulating. That's the word they used. And they said this is their ability to shrink objects or to enlarge them in size. It's very strange. There are some very strange spatial anomalies of sort of even a more bizarre kind in which UFO abductees change size. One case that shows this comes from Denise and Bert Twiggs. They wrote a really interesting book called Secret Vows about their encounters. They were in Molalla, Oregon, where they started having repeated encounters with UFOs and missing time. At first, it was very scary. They went under hypnosis and recalled being physically examined by what appeared to be gray-type ETs. But as they continued to have encounters, they had less fear, and they started to be treated differently and had more interactive and friendly encounters. And it sort of became this incredible contactee case, which was actually very benevolent. They reported several healings. They reported being taken on board a mothership, seeing all kinds of things, alien animals, strange plants being grown, engine rooms, sleeping quarters, and just had a lot of encounters. And one strange thing they kept noticing was that when they were on board the craft, they would be different heights. They know their own height, but sometimes they would be shorter than the ETs themselves, sometimes taller, or sometimes even shorter or taller than their own family. And it took them a long time to figure out what was going on. As Denise Twiggs writes, and I'm quoting, "One reason for the apparent variance in heights comes from the astonishing fact that the andromes can manipulate in size. They can shrink themselves and others as well. It took several meetings and recollections of other contactees for this twist in their technology to get through to us. They call the ETs the Andromes. The Andromes say they come from the Andromeda galaxy and do have this apparent ability to change people in size. And they actually put on a demonstration for Denise Twiggs using her friend Elizabeth. As Denise Twiggs writes, and again I'm quoting, "It was a meeting in which they had Elizabeth participate that finally proved their point. I knew from a conscious point of view how my height compared to Elizabeth's. Elizabeth and I began our meeting in a shrunken condition, but she was returned to her original height in front of me. That showed me what was happening. Elizabeth also retained a part of that particular memory. Shrinkable people. What next in this incredible universe?" So yeah, this is what Denise and Bert Twiggs say, that the ETs have the ability to shrink people. This is what Betty Andreasson says. This is what Carl Higdon thought he had happened to him, so maybe it did. Another case comes from researcher Jenny Randalls. This is a really interesting case. This occurred in 1976 to the Sunderland family of Flint, North Wales. The main witness is really Gaynor Sunderland, the daughter. She was about 12 years old, and her little brother Darren. In 1976, they had this incredible encounter outside their home where their silver saucer landed in the field. And both Gaynor and Darren saw this. Darren was actually a little closer, and he reported something very strange. He saw this saucer land, and he looked inside through portholes, and inside he could see that everything looked really small. He saw these beings that appeared to be about 3 feet tall. But this door opened up, and there was this ramp, and as these beings came down the ramp, they increased in size. They actually grew. So there was this weird spatial anomaly where the space on the inside of this craft was different from the space on the outside. And Gaynor saw this as well. She was from a different vantage point. She saw the UFO, she saw the beings, and following this incident, the whole family started having encounters. There was a number of sightings. Gaynor had missing time. She recalled being taken on board a craft with her brother Darren. It was a long, drawn-out encounter. They were physically examined. They were taken to what appeared to be like an alien zoo where they saw different strange animals. They were given warnings and messages about possible future disasters, just as many abductees have been given. So a very complicated case, which is supported by multiple family members. Interesting here is a very strange incident that happened at one point. Gaynor Sunderland watched her brother getting taken on board, and before he was taken on board, her brother Darren was struck by a beam of light which shrank him down to a diminutive size, to just a few inches. So very strange, and I'm not sure why they're doing this. I do know one lady who has regular contact, and before I did this video, I called her up and asked her about this, and just gave her an open-ended question. Have you heard of ET's ability to change the size of people? And she says, oh yeah, she did have an experience involving this. And she was taken into a craft, and she saw a gray type ET and another man, a human being, being shrunk down in size to just a tiny little size. And she became very concerned and alarmed because she thought they might be being injured. And the gray she was with told her not to worry, everything was okay, that the man was being shrunk down and that he was fine, but that he needed to do this because there was something he needed to experience and something he needed to see. So apparently they do have this ability to really shrink down people in size, and not only that, to actually grow them in size. Because of course it does go the other way. As the Twiggs family said, sometimes they would be taller than they would normally be. But there are other cases that are even more dramatic than that. You may have heard of the television science fiction, or the feature film, The Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Was remade with Daryl Hannah. What's interesting about that film is that effect of being enlarged was actually caused by a UFO, and that's what happened in an actual case. It's a very interesting and well-known case. It attracted quite a bit of attention from UFO researchers, such as Jim and Coral Lorenzen, as well as from Project Blue Book officers as well. It's a very interesting case. It occurred on April 29th, 1964. The main witness is Sharon Stahl. She's a 12-year-old schoolgirl who was actually at school at the time at Lowell Elementary School in New Mexico. And Albuquerque, New Mexico. She saw this egg-shaped object. It wasn't very large, appeared to be metallic. It was hovering above the playground in this weird sort of yo-yo pattern. Her sister saw it as well. Sharon watched it for about 20 minutes and then returned to her class and began to feel unwell because her face was burning. She went to the nurse and had to be rushed to the hospital, where she was diagnosed with second-degree burns to her face and neck and chest. It affected her vision and caused her some pain for sure. And she had some very alarming symptoms in the weeks that followed. Afterward, she actually grew more than 5.5 inches and gained 25 pounds. And that was just the beginning. As her mother says, a while ago, she was just a child who liked to play with dolls and paper cutouts. Now she is suddenly mature and grown up, cooks meals by herself, cleans house, and takes care of the younger children. So she was not only physically grown, but she was mentally grown. So I'm not sure what's happening here, but it's a very interesting case to say the least, and the effects continued. Before the encounter, Sharon was 4 feet and 8 inches tall and weighed 85 pounds. And by the 1 month later, she was 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed 110 pounds. And according to her mother, was still growing. As Miss Stahl says, "My daughter has outgrown all her clothes and quickly outgrows new garments and shoes. I'm so confused, I don't know what to believe. I know my daughter saw something in the sky that day, but I don't know what. It has been a nightmare ever since. I wish I had just let her play hooky that day." So it appears that the ETs do have the ability to enlarge people, and another case that might speak towards that is that of John Hunter Gray, also known as John Salter or John Hunter Bear. John Hunter Gray is a very well-known social activist fighting against racism, and also very well-known in the UFO field, particularly for an encounter he had on March 20th, 1988, with his son. They were driving through Richland Center, Wisconsin, when they came upon a UFO. They had missing time, and in the weeks that followed, they recalled what happened. And what they recalled was just your typical onboard UFO experience. They were physically examined. John Hunter Gray remembers being given several injections in various parts of his body, like near his glands and stuff. And following this encounter, he started to have some very interesting health improvements. About 20 of them he counted, including, as this is just a partial list, his cuts started healing faster, his bruises, his wrinkles started disappearing, old scars disappeared, he started getting 5 o'clock shadow, He quit smoking. He gained weight. He had hair growing faster, stopped getting sick, all kinds of really wonderful physiological improvements, sort of a health upgrade. And what's really strange is he grew like 3 inches in height. And it's not clear whether this happened in the weeks that followed or perhaps instantaneously, but it definitely happened because it wasn't only his height that increased, but his shoe size also increased. And more than just one size. So this was a dramatic physiological change, and perhaps he wasn't actually, growing, but had been enlarged, so to speak. Hard to say. And the reason I say that is because another gentleman contacted me, because I had, written about this previously in my book, Not From Here, Volume 2. I was studying cases of this kind, people who've been shrunk down or enlarged. And I wrote about it in that book, and he read that chapter and contacted me because he had this experience. And he said after he would be returned from an encounter, he would sometimes be shorter than his normal height and sometimes be taller. It was always just a couple of inches, but he's definitely noticed it, and it was a very, very interesting side effect, which was directly related to having this UFO encounter and I guess being taken on board a craft. So again, I'm not sure what's happening here. That's kind of why I want to explore it in this video. But what it does show is ETs have definitely got a very advanced technology. They've mastered the ability to control not only time, apparently, but space itself, and are able to have these UFOs that are larger on the inside than on the outside. They're able to shrink down their craft to tiny little things and actually shrink down people as well. So it's just an amazing display of their technological ability. I think it has something to do with their understanding of the electromagnetic spectrum and their use of light, because that's what we're seeing in a number of these cases. People are shrunk or enlarged using light beams. We do know their beams of light have the ability to not only paralyze a person or perhaps cause them to forget, but also to injure or heal them. There are many cases of people being burned, people being healed. Paralyzed, as I said, also has the ability to render solid objects invisible or permeable, such as the wall of a person's house. They pull a person right up through the wall in a beam of light. All kinds of abilities these beams of light have to communicate, to levitate people as well. So these are incredible beams of light that apparently have the ability also to shrink and enlarge. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. This incredible ability of the ETs. So thanks once again for listening. I hope you found it interesting and keep having fun.